Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. On May 23rd, David and I recorded a live webinar with Dr. Andreas Malm of Sweden's Lund University. We spoke with him about his new book, Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown, that he co-authored with Wim Carton. But you probably know the name Andreas Malm from his 2019 book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. It inspired a critically acclaimed 2022 action film of the same name. Andreas is known for challenging orthodoxy, such as attachment to nonviolence and incrementalism in the face of an escalating planetary problem. In his view, the world, with one exception that we get into, has failed to confront fossil capital, and time for polite persuasion has run out. It was a lively conversation that I know you'll enjoy. Now here's the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 6, Episode 12 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host David Keith. Our third co-host, Sarah Hastings-Simon, is still on medical leave, but she is on the mend. Now, has the world surrendered to climate breakdown? That's the question posed by our guest, Andreas Malm, who's an academic, climate activist, and author of, most notably, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. More recently, he's the co-author of the book Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown with Wim Carton, and that's the first of two books looking at what do we do now that we've exceeded warming targets like the 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial target. So today we're going to explore his arguments in Overshoot and how to blow up a pipeline, and go further. Why and how has the world surrendered to climate breakdown? What strategies and ethics might guide more aggressive forms of climate action? And what might any of this mean here in Canada, where climate barely registered in our recent federal election? Dr. Andreas Malm is an associate professor of human ecology at Lund University, whose research focuses on the intersections of climate change, capitalism, and political resistance. He is also the author of several influential books, including the two that I mentioned. And that second book with Wim Carton on what do we do now is called The Long Heat, Climate Politics When It's Too Late. And that's due out in October. And Andreas joins us from his home country of Sweden today. Welcome, Andreas.
Thank you so much, Ed. And thank you, David. It's a real honor to talk to you.
So is the long heat, I'm not supposed to jump in now, but is that a reference also to my wonderful, beautiful colleague's book here, The Long Thaw, David Archer's book?
Yeah, I just proofread our book and I realized that, and we have references to the long thaw. So it's a kind of I don't know if it's intentional, but clearly it's a very close title.
Yeah, well, it's that I've read How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I haven't read your new book yet, but
No, that's fine.
David is a dear colleague, and that book of his is really terrific.
Yeah, it's a very good book.
Anyway, Ed, sorry to jump in.
No worries. And The Long Thaw has been on order through the Canmore Library for months now. And it's a good reminder. I need to check in to see why they're having so much trouble getting it.
Or because it's a Alberta book banning. You could think of a lot of conspiracies. I mean, let's just go wild here. Remember what province we're living in and who's in charge of it.
Yeah, that's the more likely hypothesis, David. Maybe Holly Buck would have something to say about that. Andreas, remind our listeners of the concept of overshoot. And just as context, we've done shows on carbon removal and solar geoengineering recently. We've had Adrienne Abicas, a French diplomat, and Kim Campbell, our former prime minister, from the Overshoot Commission on in the past, but that was a few years ago. So remind us of the concept of overshoot.
Yes, I think overshoot can mean a couple of different things. I mean, the most basic definition of it would be that you overshoot, simply transgress a boundary such as 1.5 degrees of global warming, and that's it. But it has come to mean something more similar to overshoot and return. So this would be the notion that you can actually cross this limit, say 1.5 degrees, it could also be 2, it could be a higher limit potentially, and then return to it by means of carbon dioxide removal. So the idea would then be that you can essentially you can miss the goal of 1.5 degrees and go beyond it, but then hit it later by taking out the excess of CO2. Of course, then there's also, there's an old history of the idea of overshoot in ecological science, which means something different, namely that you over-exploit ecological resources in general, so there is overshoot day and these things. That's not what we talk about in the book, but it's more like strictly and specifically overshoot in debates surrounding climate that we're dealing with. But clearly we are now in overshoot territory because we're crossing 1.5 degrees. So this is our world now. The average temperature last year was 1.55 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline. Now that's not sufficient to say officially declare that now we've crossed 1.5, because the scientists say we have to have an average over a couple of decades to be able to say that. But things are happening so fast. The warming is accelerating, so these old criteria might soon be obsolete, and we might very soon be, rushing towards the next limit. So clearly, overshoot is now. It's happening in that basic sense.
Got you. So we're in a world of overshoot, but you go further and you argue that the world has surrendered to climate breakdown. So let's start with the why. Like what forces or failures, in your view, have led to this kind of global capitulation to the climate challenge?
Yeah, so the subtitle to this book is How the World Surrendered to the Climate Breakdown. And of course, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, because it's not like there's no one out there who is trying to fight this catastrophe anymore. But there is, I think, generally a sense of almost resignation to this fate of transgressing 1.5. And you referenced the recent election in Canada, and I think this is very widely this is the picture generally, that climate has plummeted on the political agenda for the past 5 years, since the outbreak of the pandemic, I would say. The climate movement is a shadow of its former self in the global north. The far right is in the ascendancy again, and the far right is still as wedded to classical climate denialism as ever. I'm thinking, of course, of Donald Trump, but also the AfD, which now dominates German politics. It's a similar situation here in Sweden. There are just so many cases. So there is a general resurgence of anti-climate politics, also, of course, boosting fossil fuel production, companies retreating from previous nominal commitments to net zero or to investing in renewables. There is this general backlash against climate that takes a lot of different manifestations. And this is happening right at this moment when we are moving beyond 1.5 degrees. So in that sense, there is something like a surrender to the fact of climate breakdown, rather than an intensified struggle against it when it is exacerbated in the way that it is.
Can I jump in and say, I think politically what you said is my read as well. That is agreed that there's much less climate activism than there was 4 or 5 years ago. But on the other hand, if you look at what's happening on the ground with decarbonization, there's much more happening than 5 years ago. Really stunning. And it seems there's, most mainstream forecasts now suggest that global peak of emissions will be this year, perhaps next. So in some sense, by funny coincidence, we're passing 1.5 roughly at the same time as one of the grand turning points of the climate fight, which, of course, as we all know, doesn't mean the climate fight's over, because you don't stop it warming up until you get to net zero emissions. But the fact that after centuries of long rise of fossil fuels, it really looks like we're pretty much at the peak. Perhaps this year is actually the peak. And I think it's interesting to think about the juxtaposition of those two facts, because just the sheer kind of flow of action, of money, of hardware for decarbonization has been much more in the last few years than it was, say, 5 years ago.
Well, inshallah, as we Arabs or Arabophiles like to say, I hope you're right. I hope this peak will happen, but I'm a little bit jaded because I've heard these predictions about an imminent emissions peak many times before, and so far they haven't happened. Emissions still continue to increase. And I wouldn't agree with there being a general trend towards decarbonization, but there are important tendencies in that direction in some parts of the world economy, notably power generation in the European Union, where you see an actual emissions drop and you see something like an actual switch, a transition from coal to renewables in the power generation sector. And yes, this shift has a kind of momentum regardless of what parties are ruling European countries, it seems. However, generally, globally, broadly, I still think that we're seeing not only continuous, but increasing investment in fossil fuel production virtually across the board. So according to the International Energy Agency, investment in oil and gas increased by 9% in 2023 and then by 7% in 2024. So this means almost 1/10 more capital invested in upstream production of oil and gas per year. So it's not only that investment is continuing, but it's actually increasing. And when it comes to coal, of course, what's central here is what's happening in Asia. And there you have China. Yeah, they're building a fabulous amount of solar panels and wind turbines in China, but they're also opening coal-fired power plants and coal mines at a rate that's higher now than what it was 10 years ago.
Not for production. So the latest analysis shows Chinese emissions are actually down year on year for the first time. And I've been following this, for 35 years. I've never seen most of the forecasts show a peak. Cement went down globally for the first time. Electricity is down not just in Europe, but in the UK, in North America and China. China's built a lot of coal plants, but they're not dispatching them.
What do you mean?
That's why you see electric power emissions going down in China.
Yeah. Again, I hope you're right. I would like nothing else than to see emissions drop. But the winds are very much blowing in the direction of investment of capital flowing towards fossil fuels on a global scale in the key producing countries, in the US, in the Gulf countries. You see accelerated investment and a much more intense flow of capital into fossil fuels than what you did just a few years ago. And this is because they've become so irresistibly profitable since 2022. So you have all sorts of companies, and this applies to a country like Norway too, the largest oil and gas producer in Europe, where Equinor just recently, like all the other majors, said we're going to ditch our commitment to investing in renewables because it doesn't generate the profit that oil and gas does. And this has been the general trend. And Donald Trump, with his extremely aggressive assault on the legal and regulatory environment for renewable energy production, and his attempts to revive the coal industry and remove all limitations on fossil fuel extraction, he is just a manifestation of an underlying trend that is integrating what the BP is doing, what JP Morgan is doing, what the Saudis are doing, but they were never much interested in renewables anyway. But generally, capital keeps flowing into opening new fossil fuel installations. And as we know, this is completely incompatible with any kind of climate mitigation. First of all, trying to cap global warming to 1.5 degrees. This is what the International Energy Agency said very famously in 2021. We can have no new installations, no new oil fields open, pipelines built, gas terminals, coal mines, and things like this. Now, I just came back from 2 weeks in Colombia, which is an incredibly fascinating case, because this is the only fossil fuel producing country in the world that has a government that is doing exactly these things, namely handing out no new licenses for exploring for oil and gas, or for fracking, or for opening coal mines. Since the Petro government came into power in 2022, ironically, when the whole world turned in the other direction, this single fossil fuel producing country, which is extremely dependent on fossil fuels for its economy, it's more than half of its revenues come from the export of oil and gas and coal. This country is doing exactly this. no more new installations. Unfortunately, we're likely to see a political shift in Colombia too when there are elections next year. But what really struck me on the ground in Colombia is how exceptional this is and how isolated this case is and how anomalous it is that you have a fossil fuel producing country that's actually deciding to say, we're going to phase out fossil fuels. I mean, the equivalent in Canada would be a government saying, we're not going to build a single new pipeline. We're not going to explore for a single new drop of oil or gas in this country. I mean, you imagine how revolutionary that would be. It's unheard of anywhere else, but it's the only kind of policy that is in line with climate mitigation. And there's only one country of any importance that's doing it.
I would argue that in Canada, the federal government, well, first the provincial government under a previous government here in Alberta, and then the federal government has tried to cap emissions on Canadian oil and gas emissions. And, one of the largest pools of carbon and emitted carbon in the world in the oil sands, which some argue is a de facto cap on production. You won't hear that coming from government officials. They say it's a cap on emissions. I'd argue it actually is a cap on production. And that seems to be unique outside of cap and trade systems in the world. But I want to go back, Andreas, to this Colombia example, because let's say it is the absolute exception. And you've argued that liberal democracies and their economies have failed to address the climate crisis. And you alluded to it with the investment in fossil fuel production and also the different profit margins between, say, a fossil fuel project that's, producing 40% plus return on invested capital versus some renewables projects, many that have single digits or very low single digits. So what is it about the structure or the logic of liberal democracies and economies that make them so poorly suited to tackling something like climate breakdown? And to get into the political side, is there any version of democracy outside of Colombia that could really rise to meet the challenge?
Yeah, well, so I would hesitate to frame this as liberal democracy being the problem, or that an electoral democratic system is what blocks us from, what prevents us from doing mitigation. I mean, Colombia is fascinating for many reasons. One being that it's a kind of an almost ideal type scenario since 2022. So the background to, of course, there's a long and complicated history in Colombia, but the immediate background is that there was a massive popular uprising in Colombia in the years 2018, 19, and 21 against various kinds of, social inequalities, neoliberalism, all kinds of problems in the country, which was then translated into an electoral campaign that won the presidential election in 2022. And for the first time, you had a progressive government in Colombia. So what's happened in Colombia since 2022 is an exercise in democracy. It's not like, it's in spite of democracy that you see what has happened in Colombia, but it's an extension of democracy. It's winning state power by means of contesting democratic elections and then using that popular mandate to actually keep the promises made in the presidential campaign, which is quite rare that you have a presidential candidate who says, I'm going to do these things. And Gustavo Petro said, I'm going to stop all new fossil fuel permits, and then he's actually done this for 4 years next year.
So I want to kind of challenge the assumption. Results are different from rhetoric. There's lots of reasons why. Politicians say any kind of crap they need to get elected. That's the way, sadly, our systems work. But what people say and what happens in countries are different. So emissions in the U.S. are down a lot since 2006. Emissions in Colombia are up a lot. It's not just the European Union. Emissions in the electricity sector, as I said, in China are down. They're down 1.6% the last year. I think it's really hard to imagine they're coming back up again, given the changes. I'm not a champion of the U.S. certainly under this completely hideous government, but I think you need to look both at rhetoric and at results. Trump is saying all sorts of outrageous BS, but I think the likelihood of big expansion of U.S. fossil fuel production is pretty small. I don't think he doesn't magically control it. and the forces that are driving it down aren't changing that much.
I mean, here I would read the situation differently, because I don't think the key metric in this case is national emissions, but production. So you say that US emissions have decreased since 2006. Well, this might be the case, but what's really transformed the global energy economy is the rise of the US to the status of the world's largest producer of oil and gas, courtesy of first Barack Obama, and then the first Trump, but not the least Biden. And now what the second Trump wants to do is to just intensify this trend of increasing production of oil and gas. I agree with you that it's probably going to be difficult for him to resurrect the coal industry, but oil and gas in the US seem to be booming. Now, when it comes to Colombia, what's happening there isn't a matter of national emissions. What they have achieved isn't so much a question of decreasing their national emissions, because the oil and the gas and the coal that's being produced in Colombia is exported. So the remarkable achievement of the Colombian government is to have overseen a fall in the output of fossil fuels in Colombia, a massive reduction in the production of oil and gas and coal, and also deforestation for that matter, another extremely important factor. But this is because, the Colombian economy is structured in a completely different way from the American or the Swedish economy. Colombia is a country that produces raw materials and sells them on the world market. It's a classical peripheral economy in that sense, and it's been extremely structurally dependent on exporting fossil fuels, which makes it all the more impressive that it's a country like this that decides to forego this source of income, when a country like the US or Norway or Canada has a much more diversified economy, and it would be countries less damaging to the economy to phase out fossil fuels. But you don't see this in rich countries.
That argument I buy. I agree with that distinction, and for lots of reasons, both the global environment and the future of Alberta, given that I think we are going to see fossil peak pretty quickly as we need to, I would like to see the Albertan Canadian government begin to drive production down. So I agree with you that it's very different. The situation in Colombia is different in that sense, yes.
But David, I've heard you say a few times now about global emissions peaking next year, or perhaps as soon as this year. That strikes many as counterintuitive. What source? Where are you drawing that conclusion from?
Most of the big forecasters are more or less saying that. So IEA is bounced whether it's this year or next year. Rystad says that. McKinsey says that. These are mainstream forecasters. I think it's not, you can look at a little Twitter back and forth I had with one of the really great folks from the Global Carbon Project. I mean, I think nobody knows what will happen, and things may turn around, emissions may keep going up. So, I mean, we can only celebrate the peak once it's really beyond us. I think there are reasons to believe it's real, given how many forecasters are suggesting it. It's a balance between the fall of coal and the continuing rise of gas, exactly when the peak happens. But, some of the peaks, the fact that cement peak now appears to be in a past is a big deal. And I think that's the sort of structural change that China's kind of finished the build out and demographically finished it. I think the scale of investment of renewables investment for electricity and decarbonization is just stunning. So something like 80% of the total capital investment in electricity last year was in clean energy. And the overall, the world spent $2 trillion on clean energy last year, and depending on how you measure upstream oil and gas, it's something like a quarter of that. So that's just a different world than we lived in before.
Let me just clarify that I don't dispute these figures about the build-out of renewables, and that this is a real positive trend, of course. I just find it's too early to say that we are in a process of energy transition, because the general pattern is rather one of energy addition, where renewables are added on top of fossil fuels and where investment in fossil fuels is continuing.
I would say that for electricity sector, you could argue it's a transition because you really are seeing electricity sector. But I agree that that's not true globally. We don't know. I think whether or not the peak is this year or the next few years, who knows? Obviously, again, as we all violently agree, peak doesn't remove the climate problem. Peak just stops the rate at which we're making it worse, stops increasing. But I still think the peak is important. And I think there is an interesting way, maybe to poke you a little bit, that, to be clear, I don't think we would have made this progress without climate activism. I don't think it's happened just because capitalism got green. I think climate activism has absolutely been central to driving the policy that got us here. So I completely salute climate activism and consider myself to some extent part of it. And I think even strong activism, and certainly including civil disobedience, I think we needed to get this action to happen. But I think there's a way in which, because there's so much further to go, sometimes climate activists are unwilling to recognize the actual successes that are happening. And I think we will very likely see an emissions peak within the next year or two. And I think the climate activist community needs to get used to how the world will look different when emissions are declining. They won't be declining anywhere near as fast as you or I would want, but they will quite likely be declining soon. I mean, you don't get all those, I've never seen all those mainstream forecasters say it's going to happen in a year or two. To be clear, I don't want to sound like I'm just thinking like technological change is going to solve it. I really agree with much of what you say about corruption and the need for action and so on. But I don't think, I mean, rhetorically, if I'm trying to incite people to be concerned, I'd say once you build it for a century. But if I'm guessing, I think no chance at all. I mean, electric vehicles are happening. They could be happening faster. There's a lot of stupid stuff. But I think, the oil peak is going to happen. The oil peak is going to happen later than the gas peak and the coal peak for sure. But 2030 or very early 2030s, and that's hard to see it doesn't happen given the change in light duty vehicles. And so I think the answer is it'll go down from that. And I don't think everybody's going to be producing them because there's not going to be a market. Not for that much production. I think it'll be a market that's slower.
Yeah. I mean, again, I hope that you're right. It's just that the trends, the actual trends in the real world in recent years have not been those trends. I mean, we haven't seen a decline in oil production or investment. To the contrary, we're seeing the opposite. So yes, I mean, I hope you're right. I hope that the world makes another turn, but I find it difficult to trust that these scenarios will play out of their own accord, regardless, for instance, of how reactionary politicians come into power. I mean, to return to the case of Colombia once again, what's happened there hasn't come about through any kind of natural, spontaneous process, but because of political decisions. And it now seems very likely that these decisions will be revoked next year, and that you will have what will be the most damaging, namely a massive fracking boom in Colombia, because they have some of the largest potentials for fracking in Latin America that so far have been left untouched. But, you can have a right-wing government that comes into power and say, we're going to go all in for this, just as Donald Trump is doing. And of course, that's going to have real effects on output and further down the road on emissions. And, with the political trends in the world right now, I struggle to be as hopeful as you are. Again, I hope you're right and I'm wrong.
Yeah, we all share that hope. So a couple things, and I want to go back to climate denialism and the climate movement being a shadow of itself. So on it being a shadow of itself, we're seeing, take the Canadian example, if anything, a lot more money going into the climate movement to fund those think tanks and NGOs and activists working on it. What do you mean by it being a shadow of itself? Do you mean actually that there's fewer capacity in the climate movement, or you've got a bunch of groups that are demotivated these days and less money is going in? Or is it just a consequence of right now, and I've been in the climate movement for decades, the ebbs and flow, and right now we're in a tough time with the rise of a bunch of right-wing governments and this shift away, and particularly with industry, from doing anything serious on climate change?
Yeah, so I don't know the Canadian scene, I have to admit, but my description here is based on Europe. And in the years 2018-19, early 20, there was this major protest cycle that was primarily fueled by Fridays for Future, the Greta Thunberg school strike movement, and Extinction Rebellion, and somewhat differently, Ende Gelände, the movement against coal mines in Germany with its climate camps. Now, all of these three movements are, absolute shadows of their former selves, insofar as they exist at all. I mean, Fridays for Future barely exists. XR, Extinction Rebellion, has fragmented into different offshoots. I mean, it still exists in the UK and in some other countries, but again, extremely weak. Perhaps most disastrously in Europe, the movement in Germany has been reduced to a trickle, because Germany used to be the powerhouse of the climate movement. The one exception here is France, where you have a very vibrant environmental movement called the Sol Moderateur, but it's not as a narrowly defined climate movement. It wages a much more variegated kind of battle against infrastructure projects and in defense of local land and stuff like that. But I don't think there's any doubt that the climate movement, and I'm not talking about, in terms of money, but in terms of activism, the numbers of people involved in activities, what they're doing, it has basically left the scene compared to 5 years ago, for various reasons that you can analyze, and I think you can make sense of this development. But I think it's pretty clear that that's what has happened.
Yeah, I think I'm sure Ed and I agree. And I think the question is, what happens next? What's the next wave of the climate movement? Because to do anything that really, to stop making the climate worse, we need to bring emissions to zero. And that is even forgetting the question of whether we try and then reduce concentrations of carbon dioxide or do other things. And that requires, the climate movement that I would like, that I think you would like, would be much stronger and really thinks more seriously about how to decarbonize rapidly while allowing and protecting the rights of the poor in the world to grow, and how that we do that in the developed world, I think, is a central question. And that's where I really want to hear your kind of sense about what happens next. I agree that it's the last big wave of the climate movement has clearly done just what you say. The question is, what's next? How to reinvigorate it in a new form.
The world is such a mess right now, and the potential for various kinds of catastrophic events is, in my view, pretty big. And I think a major reason for the decline of the climate movement since 2020 is a series of disastrous events, notably the pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, and the genocide in Gaza. These three have really changed the political landscape that the climate movement operated in the years before that. Now, I think one trend that you can perhaps discern is struggles moving to the field of adaptation. So a lot of the struggles in France, particularly against these mega bassins, these big water reservoirs that are part of the French countryside, a lot of this struggle is concerned with adaptation projects. So these huge water reservoirs are built presumably to make it easier for agribusiness companies to adapt to a drier and warmer climate. You had a major event in Spain last year with these floods in Valencia in late October that killed more than 200 people. And a fortnight later, you had something like 100,000 people on the streets of Valencia marching and also rioting in anger over the way that the authorities were seen to have let them down and abandoned them to these floods, these being right-wing authorities with a kind of an anti-climate politics. So you can see here in Europe trends of political activity having to take up issues around adaptation, which is one of the things that we theorize in our book, Wim and I, about, what do we do when climate politics when it's too late? Well, now we actually are seeing more and more of these impacts, these major disasters, and of course they're going to make people upset in various ways. The question is, will they prompt people to renew the struggle around mitigation? So in the case of Valencia, for instance, we argue this in the book. What you did not see in Spain in conjunction with these floods was a questioning of the activities of Repsol, which in just a few months before said that now we're going to massively expand our fossil fuel assets in Venezuela. No one made these connections, or connected these dots. But instead, you had the Spanish government saying, "Okay, we're gonna have this new reform where we'll pay workers for 2 or 3 days of leave so that when there's a new extreme weather event, they don't have to travel, so that they don't get caught up in these floods. I mean, fine. I'm of course, obviously, that's a good adaptation reform. But if you continue to just dig up fossil fuels and put them on fire, you will have more and more extreme weather events. You can't just pay people to stay at home for a year.
Of course, 100%. But thinking about the way the movement might evolve, I think what you said was really interesting. The idea of the movement shifting to kind of trying to empower local people and political action on adaptation. And obviously, that isn't a substitute for cutting emissions. But, political movements shift their focus now and then, and it may be, I guess what I find pretty interesting is a parallel to the wacky politics in the U.S. with the rise of, what Holly Buck calls conspiratorial environmentalism. I would say that while they're going under different names and it's politically highly conflicted, political debate about local climate impacts and adaptation is very much alive, even in this time in the U.S. And so maybe what happens is for some years, the climate movement focuses on adaptation, which builds strength for a renewed push to drive emissions down. I don't know. I'm just trying to be optimistic.
Yeah, no, I share this. I mean, this, with all these disasters that are in the pipeline, both literally and figuratively, obviously we have to hope that there is reason enough left in this species that when people live through these disasters, they revive the original struggle against fossil fuels and the source of the problem, the driver of global warming. But I don't think, there's been this kind of expectation that when people realize how bad things are in climate, then they will open their eyes and then they will wage the big fight. Again, I hope this is going to turn out to be true, but I don't think there's any guarantee for it because there's so much irrationality in politics these days in particular. Los Angeles was burning when Donald Trump was installed as a president, and there was no immediate causal link between that extreme disaster and then kind of shift towards concern for climate in the U.S.
Yeah, and we have a premier here in Alberta who, when we have wildfires that may or may not be attributable to climate change, of course it's hard to know, but let's assume yes, then she pivots and floats sort of arson conspiracy theories. Instead of saying, oh, we've got a warming world and wildfires are on the rise. I want to go back. You wrote How to Blow Up a Pipeline in 2019, and it seems like we're having a conversation of what's changed between 2019 and today. When you'd mentioned some of the evidence for sort of world capitulation or surrender, you talked about AFD and Donald Trump and the rise of climate denialism. But I wonder, from my experiences, I think climate denialism is on the way out. And perhaps Donald Trump and the Republican Party is this massive exception in the world. But even you've got the right accepting that climate change is happening, and principally because we're having extreme weather events and people are actually seeing changes in their lifetime that are hard to deny. For instance, I just back from Indonesia and Sumatra and had chats with locals there who unprompted, without knowing anything about what I do, unprompted talked about the climate change impacts that they're seeing on the ground in places like the island of Sumatra. So it's not denialism, but it is fatalism. It's acceptance that it's happening, and then this pivot to climate adaptation. So going to David's point, well, maybe adaptation is the entry point to say, yeah, okay, there is a problem, but getting back to overshoot, my understanding of overshoot, there are kind of three legs to the stool, and adaptation is one, carbon dioxide removal is another, and then, something like solar geoengineering, which, David works on, is a third. Can you talk, Andreas, about what do you do what do you think of those three legs? And then is overshoot and these three legs of the stool seriously an entry point we can use to have conversations with the right?
Let me just first say that I think this is definitely a prediction that I've heard many times, that climate denial is on the way out. I mean, people were saying that during Obama. People were saying that during Biden. It still hasn't happened. And in Europe, it's certainly not the case that climate denial is on the way out. I mean, and here again, I have to stress the extreme importance of Germany as the main economy of this continent. And it's difficult to exaggerate the political importance of Germany in the European Union. German politics is now drowning in the surge of the AfD, which, not only is the most fascist inclined party that has had political success in Germany since Adolf Hitler, but it is also a party that has never moved 1 centimeter from the most crude classical climate denial. And according to the most recent polls, this is the single largest party in Germany. This was absolutely unthinkable in Germany 10 years ago, when there was a total consensus in the political scene in Germany that climate change is real and that we have to do something about it. Again, I wish you were right that denial is on the way out, but I don't see that this is what's happening on the ground. In the global south is another matter. I mean, obviously, if you go to Argentina, for instance, you have a crazy climate denialist in charge of that country. But in much of the global south, I mean, yes, people know and see what's happening, and it's difficult to be an explicit climate denialist, perhaps in Indonesia or in Egypt. But what really matters is what happens in the old traditional heartlands of the fossil economy in the US, Germany, Australia, the UK, and so on and so forth. Now, adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, geoengineering. Yes. So this second book that Wim and I have coming out in October, which is a beast of a book, it's more than 600 pages long, try to deal with these questions. So there's a short part on adaptation there, and then there's a very long one on removal and a pretty long one on geoengineering as well, and discuss what the potentials are. And it's just so broad, and there's so much that we could discuss, including with David on both removal and geoengineering. One of the arguments that we make is that because it's so late now and we're crossing 1.5, it's impossible to stick our hands in the sand and say that we shouldn't deal with adaptation, we shouldn't deal with removal, we shouldn't deal with geoengineering. Overshoot has become, to an extent, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, where we are now tragically unable to ignore these emerging front lines and have no choice but to engage with them in different ways. This is not to say that we should have, I think, a general acceptance of all these new technologies. So when it comes to negative emissions technologies, for instance, I think we have to be very selective and critical, and note that some of these technologies have potential, but maybe much more limited potential. I mean, what's just happened with Climeworks, which was long seen as the most, if you forgive me, Dave, with your background in carbon engineering, the most, the leading DAC company. I mean, it has a kind of a meltdown right now. We have to be very, very concrete and specific in our understanding of these technologies and what potentials they actually have. And as you yourself have said, David, DAC might have been the subject of an excessive hype in recent years. As for solar geoengineering, you mentioned Holly Jean Barker a couple of times. She was my student in 2009, and she was the one who first told me you need to pay some attention to this geoengineering thing. And I've struggled with this question since now. Then I hadn't specialized in it as David have, but I have to admit that, in contradistinction to renewable energy technologies in all its more and more fancy forms, my own development has been that the more I read about geoengineering, the more skeptical and critical I become of it, and the less I find Holly's position, or someone like Kim Stanley Robinson, who believe that solar geoengineering is something that can be used for subaltern emancipatory projects, the less I find that position credible. But obviously these are incredibly big and complicated questions. But another kind of irony in this tragic situation also is, as we've kind of mentioned, that none of these things, adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, or geoengineering, has a chance to work in the long term unless you have really successful mitigation. So the paradox here is that the absence of massive mitigation is what forces us perhaps to do these other things. But doing these other things in any kind of way that approaches success presupposes that we actually do mitigation, which is the big contradiction of this conjuncture that we're in.
Lots to draw upon there, but I do want to get to audience questions, and we have one lined up. We've got Yuri Vermet. Yuri, go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask this question. It's actually pronounced Jory with like RJ.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. Yeah, so thanks so much for bringing Professor Malm on. Huge fan of your work, if you can call it that, being a fan, but it's resonated deeply with me, and I try and incorporate it into my own climate organizing. But I think the question I want to ask is, obviously every circumstance is unique in every part of the world, but particularly where I live in Canada, in Saskatchewan, the situation I would consider to be quite dire, in the sense that our province is considering to expand its coal consumption beyond hard targets to eliminate it. They are pushing it back against federal regulations for caps on emissions and clean electricity, amongst other things. So my question for you, Professor Malm, is that where do you see the possibility for the climate movement, especially in places where they are quite reactionary, quite right-wing, to regain its strength and to actually pull levers to gain some power back in all of this? Clearly understanding that we're not going to be getting rid of capitalism anytime soon. But maybe one quick thing to add on to that is, often we're told to organize, which I understand, but often that feels like a very vague gesture and differs from the traditional labor or tenant organizing. So what does organizing look like to you in this overshoot moment? So lastly, I'll just thank you all for your time and solidarity with you in your struggle in this.
Well, thank you, Jory. Well, this is the big question. Just to say that I think the way you describe Canada, it sounds a bit like Sweden, or probably the political situation here is even worse. Sweden was one of these countries that was long seen as a forerunner, a pioneer in climate politics. Everyone was like, oh, Sweden, you think so much about the environment. But the right-wing government that we've had in place now since 2022 has been systematically dismantling all kinds of climate politics in a totally Trumpian fashion. Recently, for instance, they decided to ditch 13 large offshore wind farm projects because this will make it more difficult to defend Sweden, because presumably the fighter jets can get entangled in the wind turbines, something like this. This is the kind of the political climate we're living in, and in Sweden we don't have a fossil fuel industry in Sweden like in Norway or in Canada, but it's very difficult to I think find a space for organizing and intervening in this political moment. What I've been trying to argue in recent years is that the climate movement needs to prepare to be able to strike in the heat of the moment. And what I mean is that we know that there will be new disasters. I mean, in Canada, I'm sure you're going to have new seasons of very bad wildfires. Who knows if it's going to happen this summer or the next? I mean, you're aware of, you've experienced this in Canada, and it's going to come again. It's going to happen again. And at some point, the climate movement needs to be able to strike in the heat of this moment and say, look, folks, if you think this is bad, you have to realize that this shit is just going to get worse if we keep taking fossil fuels out of the ground. So the movement should try to prepare for timing its actions to these outbreaks of disaster, to make the cognitive breakthrough that is so crucial to open people's minds to the idea that there is a causal link between what's going on under the ground, or rather what we're taking out of the ground, and these disasters that that are destroying our lives. This is what the climate movement failed to do in Spain and in Valencia, because there were marches, there were even riots, but they didn't target the source of the problem. And this is what urgently has to be made. And now, what does that look like on the ground? Well, that's difficult to say in a kind of general sense. This is up to activists and their communities to figure out, how do we prepare for the next wildfire in Canada? What do we do? What kind of actions against the fossil fuel industry can we time to this event to try to make the connect the dots that really need to be connected? You see what I mean? But I can't give any kind of general advice on how to organize, I think, because as I said, I don't know the Canadian context at all.
And Andreas, and maybe this is a loaded question, but difference between 2019 and 2025, when the climate movement is a shadow of its former self, at least in Europe, that's, would you say, is a failure of tactics and an almost religious-like commitment to nonviolence?
That's definitely not the only factor. Maybe it is one. I mean, I mentioned Les Soulèvements de la Terre in France, which is the big exception to this pretty dismal scene in Europe, and they stand out for using sabotage and other forms of militancy on a mass scale. But French political culture is also unique in Europe. You know, you can smash things and you can fight with cops in France, but if you do that in Sweden or in Germany, you're immediately demonized as, you know, beyond the pale, terrorist, crazy extremists. Tactical repertoires look different in different national and local contexts, and France is perhaps not a generalizable case. But clearly, the one instance we have of a vibrant environmental movement in Europe these days that have scored actual victories locally is one that has employed sabotage and done so consistently. XR, that has had a very different attitude towards these whole things, is, like I said, there's almost nothing of it left. But I don't think that I don't think that in itself is the reason for the decline of the climate movement. I think I would point to other factors. I would point to the feeling that many people had, particularly towards the end of the pandemic, that, okay, we did all these things in 18 and 19. We brought so many people to the streets, but we didn't win. And maybe, I mean, David can tell these people that actually you did win, so cheer up, folks, and get back into action. I think maybe that's a message that people would need to hear and be convinced about. But there's a lot of sense in the movement that what we did was in vain, or it didn't give any real effect. We're pretty exhausted. There's also the problem of repression, of criminalization, of very heavy-handed, tactics and sentences from the state apparatus. And then there is this whole, geopolitical shift with the two big wars that have happened in the past few years. Of course, there are more wars, but the two that have really had a major political importance, the one in Ukraine and the one in Gaza, have really taken a toll on the climate movement in very different ways. But I think these factors are more important in and of themselves than the kind of what I would, the fetishization of nonviolence or whatever you want to call it.
Since you called me out, I'll say I think this really is this interesting tension in the movement where I think, but I'm not a great movement organizer, that there's something important about recognizing successes because it builds the energy to do more. So that's why I think this idea that we're kind of near the emissions peak is important. But of course, you don't want to oversell that because you don't want to you don't want complacency. And I think there's some delicate balance between admitting that there really has been progress as a way to encourage people to do more, but not wanting to fall into a complacency that things are okay.
Listen, before we run out of time, I want to get one more audience question in from Robert Tremblay. Go ahead, Robert.
Thanks. So the question is, so in a fragmented world where global coordination is weak, I've typically seen demand destruction as a key path for reducing fossil fuel use, since I think production cuts, they're hard to sustain politically, and I think to an extent incentivize production expansion elsewhere in the world. But on the flip side, cleaner technologies like EVs or renewables can spread more easily between different regions, even without strong policies to support. So, I think with countries like Germany and Japan, they deeply subsidized solar early on, which enabled China to scale up manufacturing to where solar is now. I'd say in my head, like Norway has a similar role with electric vehicles, maybe even reaching outside technology. Cycling culture in Netherlands and Denmark, I think, is sort of contagious as well. So I guess the question is, what kinds of climate action and policy are the most contagious, capable of spreading across borders and accelerating decarbonization? And in this sort of contagion frame, what should activism be pushing for beyond just climate action generally?
Well, I have to say that, I once wrote a book called Fossil Capital, which was entirely focused on the demand side. But the climate movement in Europe, and this clearly came from comrades' movements in the global south, giving this sort of inspiration, shifted towards a strong supply side focus after the COP in Copenhagen in 2009. And since then, I have personally considered this to be the central front line. So trying to leave fossil fuels in the ground. This is the main task, and it has the greatest potential to spread. Now, I'm sorry if I'm repetitive here in going back to the case of Colombia. That's, I was just there, and it was a very interesting trip. In Latin America, of course, you have a very rich experience of these struggles to leave fossil fuels in the ground in various ways. And I think that struggle may have only reached government policy level in one country, but it has a great potential to spread to other countries as well. Because you can already see these kind of struggles in Peru, in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Argentina, and a lot of different places. Then you have other producing countries where it's extremely difficult to envision any kind of popular politics for leaving the fossil fuels in the ground. And I'm thinking primarily, of course, of the Middle East, which is still the world's heartland when it comes to so much fossil fuels, oil and gas, and where it's extremely difficult to do any kind of organized political dissent in any form, let alone trying to target the fossil fuels. I mean, what would that look like in Saudi Arabia? You know, it's extremely hard to see anything like what's been happening in Colombia, in any of these Gulf monarchies, or in a dictatorship like Algeria or Egypt, for that matter. It's very hard to extrapolate or generalize and say this is the kind of climate policy that you can export across the world. But my impression from Colombia was that this is a really, really, really great thing, maybe the best case that we have right now. And what's so tragic about it is that it is an isolated case so far, and that Colombia is surrounded by other fossil fuel producing countries in Latin America that are maybe nominally run by left-wing governments, such as in Brazil or in Guyana, in Venezuela, but they're just barreling down, doubling down on fossil fuels, just as everywhere else. But the potential, I think, is there for possibly spreading that kind of politics. I would hope.
I think that's a good note to end on. Andreas, thank you very much. We've wanted to have you on the show for quite some time, so we're really grateful for you making the time. It's late in your day, and it's been a really rich conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Ed and David. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Amit Tandon, with help from Crystal Hickey, Finuki Arachichi, and Harris Ahmed. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the University of Calgary's Office of the Vice President Research and the university's Global Research Initiative. Further support comes from the Trache Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, the Palmer Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. We'll be back on June 2nd with special guest Rose Matiso, Research Director at the Energy for Growth Hub, to discuss energy transition in sub-Saharan Africa and the Global South more generally. See you then.